thought, Chris, you've got your book that just came out this past week. The greatest evil is war. Um, I definitely want to talk to you about that. I also want to talk a bit about the two most recent essays you've written. Let's stop pretending America is a functioning democracy and the return of fascism. And I know there's an intersection there between the book and those two essays. There's a very real intersection that speaks to American society, or morality, or culture, or soul. But I guess first, maybe to go back to it, because I know with the book that you just published, it's a very personal book. This is something that you said that you had not wanted to write about again, if I can paraphrase you. And maybe if you want to just talk about that a bit, about what led you to write this particular book.
So I had written War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which was a pretty painful experience. It wasn't cathartic, drawing on the 20 years that I spent as a war correspondent. It's not an autobiography. It's about the culture of war, what it does to individuals and societies. And the book sold very well. So there were a lot of offers from publishers after that book to write another book on war, which I didn't want to do. First of all, I didn't want to dilute what I had done. And second of all, I didn't want to get pigeonholed as a writer. So I turned those down, and I was approached by City Lights and Seven Stories Press about taking some of my war writings since War is a Force and putting them together in a book. And initially I said no for the same reason. Then when I went back and looked at how much I had written about war, and this book is different from War is a Force, because War is a Force draws on my own personal experience in war zones in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. This is really primarily interviews with let's call them the way they're looked at, the kind of human detritus of war, orphans, paraplegics, parents who have lost sons in the conflict, and it's put together in this kind of, even when I reread it, it was a rough read, but it shows the price of war, what it does to human beings. I mean, there's a chapter in there on Jessica Goodell, who was in the Marine Corps and in the mortuary unit. So that was it. It came out of this frustration that people just don't have any real conception of what a war does. The perpetuation of the war in Ukraine. It's of course the Ukrainians who will bleed along with the Russians. I mean, the families of the Russian conscripts, and then I think also because I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, I wrote a column that's in the book called Chronicle of a War Foretold. So I cover the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and I was acutely aware that NATO had been rendered redundant. It was formed in 1949 to prevent Soviet expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. I was aware of all the talk about the so-called peace dividend that we were all going to benefit from now that the Cold War was over. I was very aware that Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister in Germany, James Baker, Margaret Thatcher, everyone had promised Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany. And in fact, this really sad part is that Gorbachev, like Yeltsin and like even Putin initially, they all wanted to build a security alliance, an economic alliance with Europe. But this ran smack into the interests of the war industry, the war profiteers. They needed to create an enemy in Moscow, because otherwise they couldn't justify the expansion of NATO. And that became a very lucrative business for the arms manufacturers, who made billions upon billions of dollars converting Soviet compatible equipment to essentially make these militaries compatible with NATO. This wasn't a political opinion in terms of left or right. George Kennan, the great Sovietologist, called the expansion of NATO the greatest blunder of the post-Cold War era. You've seen Henry Kissinger. I never thought I'd see the day when I'm quoting an Ukrainian messenger, but he's right that it's extremely dangerous and foolish. You had through the WikiLeaks cables that were printed. We saw Burns talk about provoking a conflict in Ukraine and the danger of that. Uh, so
Right.
there is historical trauma if you're Russian. In the 20th century, they were invaded twice through Ukraine, once in World War One, and then again in, of course, World War Two, and then the century before that, Napoleon laid waste to Russia up to the gates of Moscow, as of course the Nazis did. So there is a legitimate reason. Now that doesn't excuse what Russia did. Under post-Nuremberg laws, preemptive war is a criminal war of aggression. But just to even put this in historical context is immediately to be attacked and written off, as if you were going to write off a historian for talking about the Versailles Treaty and the economic deprivation that took place in Weimar as one of the root causes of the rise of fascism. So it was just the kind of giddy embrace, and particularly by the liberal establishment of the Ukraine war, that kind of set me on fire to put this little book together. But it is a very tough read on purpose. War is awful, and Matt and I deal with the residue of conflict. I'm sure, as I do, it primarily manifests itself through nightmares, uh, and then just a discomfort and situations that can remind me of conflict. So that was really, the book, and that's why I did it. And I'm in this funny position as an author because I just spent 2 years sweating blood to write a book called Our Class: Trauma and Transformation in American Prison. I teach in a prison. I'll be in there tomorrow night. And I wrote this book that I'm on kind of, my heart is on every page of this book about this class that wrote a play about their lives that was eventually published and then was put on stage in Trenton, very moving. Trenton's a city, very poor city in New Jersey where the trauma of mass incarceration is very real, sold out every night, really powerful. And it didn't really sell. Most of my books sell quite well. So I told my wife, I certainly hope this one doesn't sell. I'm really depressed after Our Class. But it's there, and yeah. I mean, there's a chapter on Thomas Young. I went out and visited Thomas Young when he was a paraplegic, and and then finally completely devastated. Quadriplegic, and he couldn't even hold a pen, and he was going to unhook his feeding tubes. And I helped him write the last letter. I mean, I literally held the pen while he dictated the last letter to George Bush and Dick Cheney, which is in the book, and then his story is in the book. So, yeah, that was. But I don't enjoy writing about war, and it digs up a lot of stuff I don't like dug up.